A Christmas miracle. The mail-order bride who softened the Apache warrior's grief. The snow fell gently over the small settlement on the edge of the frontier, covering the wooden houses and narrow paths in a soft white blanket. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying the crisp scent of pine and the cold bite of winter. It was a quiet, lonely place, far from the bustling towns of the East, where life moved fast and people rarely paused to notice the world around them. Here, life was slower, harder, and at times, lonely. Clara stepped off the small carriage, her boots crunching softly in the fresh snow. She hugged her coat tightly around her shoulders, feeling both excitement and fear mingling in her chest. She had traveled for weeks from a faraway town sent through a mail-order arrangement. To some that might have sounded strange or even foolish, but Clara was brave and curious, not a woman to let fear control her. She had written letters to the family who would be expecting her, and now, finally, she was here. The settlement was small, with only a few dozen houses scattered along the hillside. Smoke curled from the chimneys, and the faint sounds of children playing and livestock moving about drifted through the air. The villagers stared as Clara walked past, her presence stirring whispers. Some were curious, others wary. Mail-order brides were not uncommon, but they were still strangers in a tight-knit, isolated world.
Every pair of eyes followed her, measuring her courage and her worthiness.
Clara kept her head high and smiled politely, feeling the weight of their attention yet refusing to let it intimidate her. She carried with her only a small trunk of belongings and a heart full of hope. Her journey had been long and difficult, but she had imagined this moment countless times. She had imagined the house she would live in, the life she might build, and the people she would meet. Yet nothing could fully prepare her for the reality of frontier life. The snow was deeper than she had expected, the wind sharper, and the faces of the villagers unfamiliar and guarded. Clara's first steps were toward the house she was to live in. It was a modest cabin with rough-hewn logs, a small stone chimney, and a thin layer of frost on the windows. She could see the warm glow of the hearth inside, and she felt a small surge of relief. At least here, there would be warmth. At least here, she could begin to make a life. As she approached the door, she heard a story whispered among the villagers. They spoke of a man named Tahani, an Apache warrior who had recently lost his family in a raid. He lived in the hills just beyond the settlement, a man shaped by grief and anger, carrying his sorrow like a shield against the world. He had once been known for his strength, his courage, and his gentle heart, but now he was silent and withdrawn. Few had seen him laugh or speak more than a word or two in months. His pain had made him feared, not hated, but respected from a distance. Clara listened with interest and sympathy. She did not see Tani as a story to be feared, but as a person to be understood. She had known loss in her life too, though hers had been different, and she had learned that grief could harden a person if left alone. Perhaps, she thought quietly, she could bring a small measure of comfort to a man who had suffered so greatly. The first days in the settlement were challenging. Clara had to learn quickly how to manage the stove, fetch water from the well, chop firewood, and navigate the icy paths between houses. The villagers were polite but reserved, offering advice in careful tones and watching her closely. Some helped her, some merely observed, and a few whispered behind her back. Yet Clara faced each challenge with patience and determination. She had survived hardship before, and she knew that survival here required resilience, courage, and a willingness to learn. One afternoon, as Clara carried a basket of supplies through the snow, she noticed movement in the trees along the hillside. At first she thought it was an animal, perhaps a deer or a coyote, but then she saw the figure clearly. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to see through everything. He was watching her from a distance, silent and still. There was something commanding about him, a presence that made the hair on her arms stand on end. She realized immediately that this must be Tani. Her heart pounded, but she did not run. She had come here to build a life, not to hide from it. She smiled gently and waved, though he did not respond. Instead, he turned and disappeared into the trees, leaving her with a sense of curiosity and caution.
Who was this man?
What had he endured? And how could she, a stranger in a strange land, possibly reach him? The following days were filled with careful observation. Clara learned the paths Tawny used, the times he was most likely to be near the settlement, and the small habits that revealed his presence. She noticed how he left food for the wild animals, how he avoided confrontation, and how he seemed to mourn silently in solitude. She did not rush him. She understood that trust could not be demanded, only earned. One morning, bundled in her coat and scarf, Clara decided to leave a small gift at the edge of the clearing where she had seen him last. It was a simple gesture, a loaf of bread wrapped in a cloth, with a note written in her careful handwriting. She did not expect a response. She only hoped he would know that someone cared, that he was not entirely alone. The days that followed were quiet, but then something unexpected happened. Tawny appeared at the edge of the clearing, his eyes cautious but curious. He did not speak, but he accepted the bread, nodding slightly in acknowledgement. Clara's heart lifted. It was a small step, perhaps insignificant to some, but to her it was a sign that even the hardest heart could respond to kindness. Clara continued her efforts slowly, visiting the edge of the clearing, leaving gifts, and offering words of encouragement. She spoke gently of her own life, of the struggle she had faced, and of the hope she carried for the future. Tawny remained reserved, but over time she noticed subtle changes. He would linger a moment longer, watch her with less suspicion, and sometimes offer a small gesture in return. A nod, a glance, or a brief smile. The villagers began to take notice as well. They saw Clara's courage, her patience, and her unwavering respect for Tawny's boundaries. Some whispered that she was foolish, risking her safety, but others admired her determination and compassion. They began to soften toward the idea that perhaps grief could be healed, and that even the loneliest heart could find connection again. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the snow turned golden, Clara and Tawny shared their first real conversation. It was brief and halting at first, with long pauses and careful words. She asked about his family, his life before tragedy, and the things he loved. He spoke little, but what he did share was filled with emotion, a quiet acknowledgement of pain and memory. Clara listened with empathy, never interrupting, never judging. By the end of that day, something had changed. Tawny did not smile openly, nor did he speak freely, but there was a light in his eyes that had not been there before. Clara felt a deep sense of hope. She understood that the journey ahead would be long, that healing was slow and fragile, but she also knew that she had taken the first step. She had reached a man whose grief had made him nearly unreachable, and she had shown him that kindness could exist even in the harshest of winters. As night fell, Clara returned to her small cabin, tired but filled with purpose. She gazed out at the snow-covered hills and imagined the life she could build here, a life where trust and compassion could bridge even the deepest divides. She knew that Tawny's journey was far from over, but she also knew that hers had truly begun. In the quiet of the settlement, with the soft glow of the hearth and the whispering wind outside, Clara allowed herself to dream of what might come. Friendship, understanding, and perhaps a connection that could soften even the hardest of hearts. And so, in the first snow of winter, a stranger had arrived, carrying hope and courage. A man who had once known only loss began to feel the faint stirrings of trust. The settlement watched silently. The wind carried their whispers, and the snow continued to fall, softening the world around them. It was the beginning of a story that would unfold slowly, gently, and miraculously. A story of healing, understanding, and the quiet magic of human kindness. The morning air was sharp with frost, and Clara wrapped her coat tightly around her shoulders as she stepped out into the quiet settlement. The snow under her boots crunched softly, and each breath formed a small cloud in front of her face. Today, she had decided to go a little further than before, beyond the edge of the village and into the clearing where she had last seen Tawny. Her heart beat faster at the thought of him, but she pushed aside fear. She knew that if she wanted to reach him, she had to approach with patience, respect, and courage. The clearing was quiet, surrounded by tall pines that seemed to touch the sky. The snow glittered like tiny crystals in the sunlight, and the world seemed still, as if holding its breath. Clara moved slowly, her eyes scanning the trees. She carried a basket with small gifts, dried meat, bread, and a few trinkets she thought might bring comfort. She had no idea if Tani would accept them, but the act itself gave her courage. Suddenly, movement caught her eye. From between the trees emerged a figure, tall and broad-shouldered, his dark hair partially covered by a hood. It was Tani. He stepped lightly over the snow, his eyes sharp and watchful. For a moment he simply observed her, silent and unmoving, as if deciding whether she was friend or threat. Clara stopped walking and smiled gently, keeping her voice soft. "Good morning," she said, her words floating lightly in the cold air. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." Tani did not respond. His gaze lingered on her basket, then back to her face. Clara noticed the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands rested near his waist, ready to defend himself if needed. She understood that trust was something earned, not given, and she lowered the basket to the ground. "I brought some food," she said calmly, pointing to the basket. "I thought you might need it." Tawny's dark eyes narrowed, but he did not move away. Slowly, cautiously, he stepped forward, his boots leaving deep impressions in the snow. He picked up a piece of bread, examining it for a long moment before nodding slightly. It was not much, but it was the first acknowledgement she had received from him. Clara's heart lifted. For several minutes they simply stood there, observing each other. Tawny did not speak, and Clara did not push. She knew that words could sometimes frighten more than comfort, and she wanted to give him space. Instead, she knelt by the basket and arranged the gifts more neatly, hoping that her gesture alone would communicate her intentions. Finally, Tawny spoke, his voice low and rough. "Why do you come here?" Clara looked up, her eyes meeting his. She spoke honestly. "Because I want to understand. Because I want to help if I can. And because I think you are not as alone as you believe." Tawny said nothing at first, his face unreadable. Then, slowly, he gestured toward a nearby log. "Sit," he said, almost like a command, but there was no anger in his tone. Clara nodded and sat carefully, keeping a respectful distance. For a long while, neither spoke. The snowflakes drifted gently from the sky, and the silence of the forest surrounded them. Clara could feel the weight of Tawny's grief pressing down like the heavy winter sky. She understood in that quiet moment that this man had known loss in its deepest form, and that he had built walls around himself to survive. Yet, even in that silence, there was something fragile and human, a hint that connection was still possible. Clara decided to start small. She spoke of her journey, her family far away, and the challenges she had faced coming to this new land. She described the settlement, the small joys she had discovered, and the loneliness that sometimes pressed in. Tawny listened, his gaze fixed on her, not with suspicion, but with cautious curiosity. "You are brave," he said finally, his voice softening slightly. "Not many would come here knowing the risks." Clara smiled gently. "Perhaps I am foolish," she said, "but I believe that kindness is never wasted. Even if you do not trust me yet, I hope you will know that I mean no harm." Tawny's eyes searched hers for a long moment. Then slowly, he nodded. "You may come again," he said. "But do not push. I am not ready to speak much." Clara felt a surge of hope. It was a small step, but it was a step nonetheless. She promised herself that she would respect his boundaries, giving him time to trust her while continuing to show care through small, thoughtful gestures. Over the next few days, Clara returned to the clearing at different times, always keeping a respectful distance. She would leave gifts, a bundle of firewood, dried fruits, a hand-stitched scarf. Sometimes she spoke to him from afar, telling short stories or sharing little observations about the village. Each interaction, no matter how small, built a thread of connection between them. Tawny began to respond, cautiously at first. He would nod when she spoke, sometimes asking a brief question about her life. On colder days, he even allowed her to bring him warm tea in a small tin cup, which he drank silently, but with a hint of gratitude. Clara noticed subtle changes. His eyes would linger on her longer, his posture would relax slightly, and occasionally she caught the faintest shadow of a smile. One afternoon, as the wind howled through the pines, Clara found Tawny attempting to repair a broken sled. The wood was cracked, and the metal runners were bent. She approached slowly, careful not to startle him. "May I help?" she asked softly. Tawny looked at her, suspicion and surprise flickering across his face. Then, after a long pause, he nodded. "Careful," he warned, handing her a small hammer. Together they worked on the sled in companionable silence. Clara passed tools when he asked, and he explained in brief words how the sled had been used to carry supplies for his family before they were lost. Clara listened quietly, sensing the grief behind his words, but also the pride in the memories. It was the first time he had shared anything personal with her. When the sled was finally repaired, Tawny nodded, his expression softening. "You have skill," he said quietly. "Few would take the time." Clara smiled, feeling a warm glow in her chest. "I have learned from my family," she said. "We always help those in need." For the first time, Tawny lingered, watching her as she packed up the tools. He said nothing more, but the moment itself was significant. Trust, he realized, could be shown in actions, not only words. And Clara, he began to understand, was patient and kind in a way that could not be faked. The villagers noticed changes too. Some had been wary of Clara's interactions with the Apache warrior, but as they observed from a distance, they saw a new softness in his demeanor. He walked taller, but less tense. He looked at her without suspicion, sometimes even with quiet gratitude. The children of the settlement, curious and fearless, began to leave small gifts near the clearing as well, encouraged by Clara's example. Slowly, Tawny's isolation began to shrink, though he remained cautious, as if protecting a fragile treasure inside his heart. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, Clara and Tawny shared a quiet walk along the edge of the forest. The snow had softened underfoot, and the cold was less biting than usual. They spoke little, letting the sound of crunching snow and distant animal calls fill the silence. Yet in that quiet, something profound passed between them, a sense of understanding, a recognition of shared humanity despite differences in culture, language, and experience. At one point, Tawny stopped and looked at Clara. "You have changed something," he said simply. "Not me entirely, but this place. I do not feel as alone." Clara felt tears well in her eyes, though she blinked them back quickly. "And you have changed me," she replied. "You have shown me strength and courage. You have reminded me why hope is worth carrying." Tawny nodded, a brief, genuine smile touching his lips. It was fleeting, but to Clara, it was like the first sunbeam of spring after a long winter. They walked a little further, side by side, two people from different worlds learning to bridge the distance between them. As night fell and stars began to sparkle in the dark sky, Clara returned to her cabin, tired but filled with purpose. She knew that the road ahead would not be easy. Tawny's grief was deep and his trust fragile, yet she had seen the first signs of healing. She had reached a man who had believed himself untouchable, and she had begun to soften the edges of his sorrow through patience, empathy, and quiet courage. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future where they could work together, share stories, and perhaps even bring joy back into a life that had known too much pain. And as she lay down to rest, the snow continuing to fall softly outside, Clara felt a deep sense of hope. She had taken the first true step toward a connection that could grow, slowly, steadily, and miraculously, even in the harshest of winters. Winter had settled fully over the settlement, painting the hills and forests in endless shades of white. The snow lay thick on the ground, softening the landscape but also making life harder. For Clara, each day was filled with tasks that tested her strength and patience: chopping wood, fetching water from the frozen well, and keeping the small cabin warm through the long, cold nights. Yet, amid the hardship, she found a quiet satisfaction. Life here was hard, yes, but it was real, and every small accomplishment brought a sense of pride. Tani had become a regular presence in her days, though still at a careful distance. Their interactions were slow and measured, but each encounter carried the weight of small victories. Some mornings he would allow her to bring hot tea, which he would drink in silence, occasionally nodding as he acknowledged her effort. Other times he would invite her to help with small chores near his camp, gathering firewood, fixing a simple tool, or even clearing snow from the narrow paths that led to a small shelter. Clara had begun to learn more about Tani's life and the customs he held dear. She noticed the way he carefully arranged his belongings, honoring traditions that had been passed down through his family. She saw the respect he showed for the natural world, leaving food for animals and treating the forest as if it were a sacred space. Each observation deepened her admiration for him. She realized that beneath the armor of grief he was a man of great integrity and compassion, shaped by love and loss in equal measure. One particularly cold morning, Clara set out to deliver a basket of supplies to Tani's camp. The wind blew sharply through the trees, and the snow swirled in delicate patterns around her. She moved carefully, aware that the slippery ground could betray her at any moment. When she arrived, she found Tani attempting to track a small wounded bird that had fallen from a tree. His brow was furrowed, and his hands were gentle as he tried to free the creature. Clara knelt beside him.
"May I help?" she asked softly.
Tani looked at her surprised, but then nodded. "Be careful," he warned. Together they worked to free the bird from the snow, wrapping it gently in a cloth Clara had brought. She watched Tani's careful movements, noticing the tenderness in his hands and the concentration in his eyes. It was a side of him few had seen, a side that spoke of patience, empathy, and quiet strength. Once the bird was safe, they built a small shelter for it near his camp, using twigs and leaves to keep it warm. "You have a good heart," Tani said, his voice low. "Few think of these small creatures in winter." "Everything deserves care," she replied. "Even the smallest lives are important." Moments like these were rare and precious. Each one chipped away at the walls Tani had built around himself. He began to trust her more, not through words, but through shared action. Clara realized that healing grief was not about rushing someone to smile or speak, but about showing patience, understanding, and consistent care. The villagers noticed the change in Tani as well. Some had been wary, even fearful of him, seeing only the grief and anger that had kept him isolated. But now they observed him laughing softly at Clara's small jokes, or walking through the village with a lighter step. The transformation was slow, almost imperceptible at times, but undeniable. It was as if Clara's presence was a quiet balm to his wounded spirit, helping him remember that the world could hold kindness and warmth once more. One afternoon, a sudden blizzard swept across the hills. The wind tore through the trees and snow fell so heavily that it was nearly impossible to see 10 steps ahead. Clara had been collecting firewood when the storm hit, and she found herself struggling against the wind. Suddenly, she heard a voice calling her name. "Clara, this way!" It was Tani, appearing like a shadow moving swiftly through the storm. Without hesitation, he guided her back to his camp, shielding her from the worst of the wind. They huddled together near the fire, listening to the storm rage outside. The moment was simple, but for Clara, it felt like a turning point. Tani's concern was no longer cautious politeness. It was genuine care. She realized, with a warmth that spread through her chest, that trust and affection were beginning to grow between them. During the long winter evenings, they spent time talking by the fire. Tani shared stories of his past, of the family he had lost, and of the traditions he cherished. Clara listened quietly, offering comfort not through words, but through the simple act of presence. She shared her own stories too, the life she had left behind, the struggles she had faced, and the hope she carried for the future. Their conversations were not always easy, but each one deepened the bond between them. One evening, as they watched the firelight flicker across the snow-covered clearing, Tani spoke softly. "I have not spoken like this in many months," he said. "It is difficult, but good. You make it easier somehow." Clara reached out, placing her hand gently on his arm. "Grief is heavy," she said, "but it becomes lighter when shared. You do not have to carry it alone." Tawny looked at her, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. For a moment he seemed vulnerable, and Clara understood that he was beginning to allow himself to hope again. She did not push him further, knowing that trust could not be forced. She simply stayed by his side, offering steady companionship and quiet understanding. As the weeks passed, Clara and Tawny faced small challenges together. They helped a neighbor repair a roof weakened by snow, rescued a trapped dog from the frozen river, and navigated the dangers of the winter forest. Each shared experience strengthened their connection, revealing the depths of their character and the resilience of their hearts. Tawny began to smile more often, though still quietly, and Clara felt a deep sense of satisfaction in knowing that her efforts were making a difference. One day, Clara brought a small handmade scarf to Tawny, woven from wool she had spun herself. She handed it to him with a shy smile. "It will keep you warm," she said. Tawny studied the scarf for a long moment, then placed it around his neck. "You think of everything," he said quietly, his voice carrying a rare note of gratitude. "Few remember such things." Clara felt a rush of warmth at his words. She knew that these small gestures were more than mere kindness. They were bridges, connecting two people from different worlds and helping them find common ground. Even the children of the village began to notice the change. They would leave small gifts of their own near the clearing: a carved piece of wood, a handful of berries, or a tiny blanket. Tawny accepted these offerings with quiet thanks, and Clara watched with a mixture of pride and relief. The walls of grief and mistrust were slowly crumbling, replaced by a sense of community, hope, and connection. One particularly still evening, Clara and Tawny stood together at the edge of the forest, watching the sun set over the hills. The sky was painted with shades of orange and pink, reflecting off the snow in brilliant light. They did not speak, but the silence was comfortable, filled with unspoken understanding. Tawny placed a hand briefly on Clara's shoulder, a gesture of trust and friendship. "I do not know what the future holds," he said finally, his voice low, "but I am glad you are here. And I am glad you are here too. Together we can face whatever comes." The night grew colder, and they returned to the camp, carrying with them a sense of quiet hope. Clara prepared a simple meal, and Tawny helped gather firewood, their movements synchronized through familiarity and trust. The fire crackled warmly, casting dancing shadows on the snow outside. For the first time in months, both felt a sense of peace that was rare and precious. Clara knew that the winter ahead would still bring challenges, but she also knew that their bond had grown stronger with each shared experience. Tawny's grief had not vanished, but it had softened, and the walls around his heart had begun to shift. The snow-covered world around them, once cold and isolating, now felt alive with possibility and promise. As she lay in her small cabin that night, Clara thought about the journey so far. She had come to this remote settlement as a stranger, unsure of what to expect, and yet she had begun to forge a connection that was slowly transforming both their lives. Tawny, once closed off and withdrawn, had begun to show the first signs of trust and hope, and in return, Clara had discovered a resilience and courage within herself that she had never fully realized before. The winter continued, each day bringing new opportunities for connection, understanding, and healing. And amid the cold, the snow, and the quiet challenges of frontier life, a fragile but powerful bond had begun to form. A bond that would grow stronger in the days to come, carrying with it the promise of warmth, companionship, and perhaps even the beginnings of love. In the heart of winter, among the snow-covered hills and whispering pines, Clara and Tawny had found something rare and precious: the beginning of trust, the softening of grief, and the quiet magic of human connection. And though the road ahead would still hold obstacles, each step forward felt like a small miracle, a testament to patience, courage, and the simple power of kindness. The first signs of December had arrived, painting the settlement in a soft, icy glow. Snow continued to cover the hills, and the pine trees were heavy with white. Clara woke early one morning, her heart light with a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. She had an idea, one that had been growing in her mind for days. It was a simple idea, but to her it felt monumental. She wanted to organize a small Christmas gathering, a celebration of warmth, hope, and community. And more importantly, she wanted Tani to be a part of it. She knew it would not be easy. Tani had spent months in grief and solitude, and while their bond had grown, he was still cautious. The villagers were kind but wary, and some had old prejudices that made them hesitant to mingle with the Apache warrior. Yet Clara was determined. She believed that small acts of kindness could create big changes, and that even the hardest heart could soften when surrounded by care, warmth, and joy. Clara began by preparing her cabin. She cleaned every corner, swept the floor, and hung small decorations she had made from pine cones, cloth scraps, and bits of ribbon. The soft glow of lanterns reflected off the snow outside, giving the space a magical, welcoming atmosphere. She then set about baking bread and simple pastries, using recipes she had learned from her mother. The sense of warm dough, sweet spices, and roasted nuts filled the cabin, drifting out into the crisp winter air. Tani watched quietly from a distance at first. Clara had invited him earlier in the day, offering the invitation with gentle words and a patient smile. "There will be warmth, food, and stories," she had said. "You are welcome, if you wish." At first, he hesitated, shifting from foot to foot, as though unsure whether to accept. Grief had taught him caution, and years of living apart from the village made trust difficult. Yet Clara's consistent care, her kindness, and her respect for his boundaries had created a bridge he could not ignore. Slowly, deliberately, he nodded. "I will come," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of careful decision. The villagers were intrigued by the idea of a shared celebration. Some were hesitant, murmuring doubts about whether Tani would attend or whether it was wise to include him. Others were quietly excited, encouraged by Clara's courage and the glimpses of change they had observed in Tani over the past weeks. Slowly, word spread, and families began to gather small gifts, prepared food, and decorations to contribute to the evening. As the sun began to set, the settlement transformed. Lanterns flickered along the streets, casting warm light onto the snow. Children ran about, laughing and playing, their cheeks rosy from the cold. The scent of baked bread, roasted meat, and pine filled the air. Clara stood near the door of her cabin, her heart pounding with nervous excitement. She could see Tani approaching, moving carefully through the snow, his eyes scanning the lights and the gathering crowd. When he arrived, a hush fell over the group. His presence commanded attention, not out of fear, but out of respect. For a moment he simply stood, taking in the sight before him. Families gathered together, children laughing, and Clara smiling warmly in the doorway. He stepped forward and held out a hand. "I am glad you came," she said softly. Tani nodded, accepting her gesture. He walked into the gathering slowly, his eyes shifting to the faces around him. The villagers watched in silence at first, then began to welcome him with quiet words and small gestures of inclusion. The tension that had long surrounded him seemed to ease, replaced by the gentle warmth of shared humanity. The evening unfolded with simple, joyful moments. Children sang songs they had learned at school, their voices carrying through the cold night air. Families shared stories of their lives, their laughter echoing across the snow-covered hills. Clara moved among the group, introducing Tani to neighbors who had been cautious or hesitant, and she watched as he began to respond, offering nods, quiet smiles, and even short words of conversation. At one point, Tani stepped outside for a moment, gazing at the snow-covered landscape. The moon reflected off the icy ground, casting a silver glow over the forest and hills. Clara joined him, standing silently beside him as the wind whispered through the pines. "It is beautiful," he said quietly. "I have not noticed it like this before," Clara smiled. "Sometimes beauty is easier to see when shared," she said. "You are not alone here, Tani. You never were, truly." He turned to her, a rare softness in his eyes. "You have brought me hope," he said, his voice low. "I did not think I could feel this again." She realized that the small acts of care, patience, and understanding over the past weeks had begun to work miracles in their own quiet way. Grief, while still present, no longer held him completely captive. For the first time, he was able to imagine joy, community, and connection. Back at the cabin, the celebration continued. Clara guided Tani through the crowd, introducing him to families and helping him feel at ease. Slowly, he began to share small stories of his past, moments of happiness and loss, his words carried with humility and sincerity. The villagers listened respectfully, understanding the weight behind his grief and the courage it took to speak. As the evening progressed, children gathered around the fire to hear stories, and Tani shared a short tale of his family, their traditions, and the love he still carried for those he had lost. His voice was quiet yet clear, and Clara could see the tears glistening in his eyes. But there was no shame in his emotion, only the strength to remember and honor what had been lost. Clara handed out small gifts she had made herself, simple tokens of care and kindness. Tani accepted them carefully, his fingers brushing hers briefly in a gesture of gratitude. In that moment, the boundaries between grief and hope, isolation and connection, began to blur. The settlement, once a place of cautious observation, became a space of shared joy and understanding. As the night deepened, a gentle hush fell over the gathering. The stars shone brightly above, scattered across the sky like a million tiny lanterns. Clara and Tani stepped aside, watching the firelight flicker and reflect in the snow. She could see the change in him, subtle but profound. The tension in his shoulders had eased, his gaze was warmer, and there was a quiet light in his eyes that had not been there before. "You have done something remarkable," Clara said softly. "You have allowed yourself to feel again." Tani looked at her, a small, genuine smile breaking across his face. "It is because of you," he replied. "You softened the edges of my grief. I did not think it possible." Clara's heart swelled. She knew that their journey was far from over, that challenges would continue to arise, but in that moment, she allowed herself to savor the joy of progress. They had taken a step together toward healing, and it was a step neither of them could have made alone. The evening drew to a close with songs, laughter, and quiet reflection. Families returned to their homes, children tired but happy, and the settlement seemed to glow with the warmth of shared experience. Clara and Tani lingered a while longer, walking slowly through the snow-covered paths. The night was silent, except for the crunch of snow beneath their feet and the occasional call of an owl in the distance. Tani paused at the edge of the clearing, looking up at the moonlit sky. "I have carried grief for so long," he said quietly. "But tonight feels lighter." Clara placed a hand gently on his arm. "It is lighter because you allowed it to be," she said. "Because you trusted that connection can exist even after loss." For the first time in months, Tani felt a sense of peace that was rare and precious. He had shared a space with others, celebrated life and hope, and allowed himself to experience joy without guilt or fear. The walls he had built around his heart had begun to crumble, not through force, but through patience, kindness, and the simple miracle of human connection. As they returned to their separate homes for the night, Clara reflected on the journey so far. The snow continued to fall gently, blanketing the settlement in quiet light. She thought of the weeks spent building trust, of the small acts that had begun to heal a wounded heart, and of the Christmas gathering that had brought light and warmth to even the most cautious and guarded souls. And in the stillness of winter, a small but powerful truth became clear. Miracles often come not in grand gestures, but in quiet, steady acts of care. Tani's grief had not vanished, but it had softened. He had begun to trust, to hope, and to imagine joy once more. And for Clara, the reward was not only in seeing this transformation, but in being part of it, side by side, sharing the warmth of compassion and human connection. The first Christmas in the settlement, simple as it was, became a memory that would linger long after the snow had melted. It was a night of gentle miracles, of bonds strengthened, and of hope rekindled. For Clara and Tani, it marked the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter where grief could coexist with healing, where loss could be honored alongside joy, and where trust could blossom even in the coldest of winters. As they each returned to their cabins that night, the stars above seemed to shine a little brighter, reflecting the light that had begun to glow in hearts that had long been shadowed by sorrow. The winter would continue, and life would remain challenging, but the miracle of connection, patience, and kindness had taken root. And in that quiet, snow-covered settlement, a Christmas miracle had truly come to life. Winter had begun to loosen its grip on the hills, though the snow still covered the ground in soft white. The nights were long and the days were short, but the settlement seemed warmer than ever. The Christmas celebration had left a mark on everyone, and for Clara and Tawny, life had taken on a new rhythm, shaped by shared trust, quiet laughter, and the growing bond between them. Clara woke early, as she often did, and looked out the frost-covered window of her cabin. The soft light of dawn reflected off the snow, and for a moment she simply breathed in the peace of the morning. Tawny had already left for the day, moving toward the hills to check on his small herd of horses. She watched him from a distance, noting the careful way he moved through the snow, his tall figure cutting a proud yet gentle presence against the white landscape. Their life together had begun slowly, step by step, but each day brought new trust, understanding, and companionship. Clara had learned to navigate the wilderness, chopping firewood, fetching water, and preparing meals in ways that honored both her background and the lessons Tawny had taught her about the land. Tawny, in turn, had opened up more of himself with each passing day, sharing his stories, his memories, and even the quiet jokes that revealed a side of him few had ever seen. The villagers had also grown to accept him more fully. Some had initially been cautious or skeptical, but observing the way Clara and Tawny supported one another, and the way he now engaged gently with the community, they began to offer trust in return. Children would run to him with small gifts, and he would accept them with a smile that was no longer hesitant, but genuine. Families began to invite him for meals and celebrations, and slowly he became a part of the settlement in a way that once seemed impossible. One morning a neighbor approached Clara's cabin with news. "Tawny is planning to clear the new path through the forest," he said. "He wants to make it safer for the settlement, and I think he wants you to see it." Clara's heart lifted. She bundled herself in warm layers and followed the path toward the hills. When she arrived, she found Tawny already at work, chopping away snow and fallen branches to create a safe route. He glanced at her and gave a small, shy smile. "It is better this way," he said. "The villagers can walk safely, and it is easier for me to help them." Clara walked beside him, helping where she could. Together they cleared debris, hauled wood, and strengthened the path. The work was hard, but their cooperation was seamless. They moved as a team, learning each other's rhythms and abilities. Each shared task brought laughter, small talks, and the comforting knowledge that they could rely on one another. As the day turned to evening, they paused to rest, leaning against the snow-covered trees. Tawny looked over the hills, then back at Clara. "I never thought I would find someone like you," he said quietly. "Someone who would see me, not just my grief. Someone who would stay." Clara reached out, touching his arm gently. "I stayed," she said softly, "because you are worth it. Because your heart deserves healing and happiness, even after so much loss." Tawny's eyes softened, and for a long moment, neither spoke. The sun dipped behind the hills, casting a warm orange glow across the snowy landscape. The world felt still, and in that stillness something deeper grew between them. A bond built not only on trust and kindness, but on understanding, shared strength, and quiet love. That evening, Clara and Tawny returned to the village together. The villagers greeted them warmly, offering small smiles and respectful nods. They had witnessed the change in Tawny, and they admired Clara's patience and courage. Slowly, any lingering doubts about their bond began to fade. People saw that grief could coexist with hope, that love could grow even in the harshest circumstances, and that connection was a powerful force capable of transforming lives. Over the following weeks, Clara and Tawny continued to build their life together. They worked on the cabin, adding small improvements, strengthening its walls against the cold, and making it a place of comfort and warmth. They shared meals, laughed quietly by the fire, and took long walks through the snow-covered hills, sometimes in silence, sometimes in conversation. Each moment, no matter how ordinary, became a thread in the tapestry of their shared life. One afternoon, Clara suggested they plant small decorations along the path they had cleared. It will remind the villagers, she said, that beauty and care can grow even in winter. Tani agreed, helping her weave pine branches, tie ribbons, and place small tokens of color along the snow-covered route. As they worked, they spoke of the future, not in grand declarations, but in quiet hopes and simple dreams. Tani shared ideas for a small garden in the spring, and Clara told him stories of her family back east, imagining a future where they could combine traditions, honor both past and present, and build a home filled with love and understanding. As the days grew longer and the snow began to melt slightly, the bond between them deepened further. Tani began to speak more openly of his family, sharing memories that had once been too painful to voice. Clara listened with care, offering comfort and acknowledgement, never pushing, never judging. Through these shared moments, the grief that had once seemed insurmountable softened into remembrance and quiet strength. One evening, as the sky turned shades of purple and gold, Tani took Clara's hand in his. "Clara," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "I have lived in sorrow for so long, but with you I see a future I never imagined. Will you stay with me?" Clara smiled, her eyes shining. "I am already here," she said, "and I will stay as long as we both wish it." Tani's heart lifted, and he felt a sense of peace and joy that he had thought impossible. The years of grief, isolation, and fear of trusting again were not erased, but they had been softened by patience, love, and the quiet miracles that Clara had brought into his life. The villagers noticed the change too. Tani walked among them with ease now, sharing tasks, stories, and laughter. Children ran to him with gifts or questions, and he answered with warmth and care. The settlement, once divided by suspicion and distance, now seemed united in hope and mutual respect. The snow-covered world, once harsh and isolating, had been transformed by connection, compassion, and courage. As spring approached, Clara and Tani made plans for the new season. They discussed planting vegetables and flowers, preparing a small garden, and continuing to strengthen their home. Tani even invited Clara to join him on trips to check distant parts of the hills, teaching her more about survival, tracking, and the wisdom of the land. Their life was simple, yet full of purpose, joy, and the quiet miracles of shared effort and care. One evening they sat together on a small hill overlooking the village, watching the sunset paint the snow in golden light. Tani took Clara's hand in his, holding it gently. "I never thought I would find happiness again," he said, "but you have shown me that even after great loss, life can be beautiful. You are my miracle." Clara leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the warmth of his embrace. "And you are mine," she replied softly. "We have found each other, and together we will build a life filled with hope and love." They stayed there for a long while, watching the stars emerge in the twilight sky. The snow glimmered under the soft moonlight, reflecting the quiet magic of a world transformed. Tani felt a sense of belonging he had not known in years. Clara felt a deep, steady joy in knowing that her courage and patience had brought healing, not only to Tani, but to herself and the community around them. As night fell, they returned to their cabin, where the fire burned warmly. The village below was quiet, yet alive with the promise of spring and the warmth of connection. They prepared a simple meal together, shared stories of the day, and planned for the future. Each act, however ordinary, was filled with meaning, proof that a life built on patience, kindness, and love could flourish even in the harshest of circumstances. Tani looked at Clara, his eyes reflecting both the firelight and the hope he now carried in his heart. "Life is not perfect," he said softly, "but with you, it is full. It is worth living, and I am grateful every day. I am grateful." Iris smiled, squeezing his hand. "We will face whatever comes together," she said, "and together we will make a life filled with joy, understanding, and love." The winter had been long and harsh, but it had also been transformative. Grief had softened, trust had grown, and love had taken root in the hearts of two people who had once walked alone. The snow would eventually melt, the seasons would change, and life would continue with its challenges. But Clara and Tani had discovered something permanent, a bond that could endure hardship, honor the past, and embrace the future. In the quiet of their cabin, with the wind whispering through the trees and the stars shining overhead, Clara and Tawny knew that they had found more than companionship. They had found home, hope, and a shared life that no obstacle could break. And in the snow-covered hills of the settlement, the story of grief, healing, and quiet miracles had reached a joyful, lasting conclusion.